John's Reads is the St. Johns County Public Library System's annual One Book, One Community event focused on creating a shared conversation around a selected novel. Many thanks to all the library staff who have organized this year's programs, and especially to Valerie Peichel, branch manager at the main library, and Kim Odom, branch manager at the Ponte Vedra Beach branch library, for steering this year's planning committee. Funding for today's conversation with author Sara Nisha Adams was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. St. John's Reads is also generously supported by the St. Johns County Public Library System Friends of the Libraries. We couldn't do any of this without them. Sara Nisha Adams is a writer and an editor. She lives in London and was born in Hertfordshire, did I say that correctly? To Indian, Kenyan, and English parents. Her debut novel, The Reading List, was a finalist in the Goodreads Choice Awards for Fiction 2021. And her second novel, The Twilight Garden, will be published in North America in spring 2024. I am so pleased to introduce Sara Nisha Adams.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Alex. I'm going to start off by reading a little bit from my book. Many of you may have read it already, but if you haven't, it's a novel about a lonely widower, Mukesh, who is grieving the loss of his wife, Naina, who is a huge bookworm. And he's trying to bond with his bookworm granddaughter. And then he strikes up a friendship with Alicia, who is a reluctant library worker. They don't hit it off at first in any way, but a list of books manages to forge a connection between the two of them. So I'm going to be reading from early on in the novel, and it's a scene that, for me, starts Mukesh on his journey. For months after Naina's death, Mukesh hadn't been able to sleep in his own bed, because being in there alone felt like being in someone else's home entirely. "Papa, you take your time," Rohini said to him at first, and Vritti had set up a bed in the living room for him. "He can't sleep there forever. He'll do his back in," Deepali had whispered to her sisters after tucking him in, a strange role reversal that made him feel an immense sense of shame. How could he be whole again when his whole had gone for good? "He'll be okay. He's grieving. I can't bring myself to go in the bedroom at all, but we're going to need to clear Mummy's stuff away. She kept it so messy," Rohini whispered back. Lying on the living room sofa, Mukesh had shut his eyes, hoping to block out the sound of their laughter. Soft, comforting laughter. He was the father. He should be looking after his girls. But he couldn't. He didn't know how to without Naina. Once a year had passed, and Mukesh Patel's time of eternal quiet had begun, that silent, lonely stage of grief, where everyone but you had moved on. Rohini, Deepali, and Vritti had insisted on finally clearing out Naina's room. "Papa, we're not letting you put this off for any longer. It's time for you to move forward with your life." And so they began sorting through the detail and debris of their mother's life, reorganizing the organized chaos Naina thrived in. Deepali, who conveniently had dust allergies, opted to cook a lunch for them instead. For that one day, his house was full of life again, but for all the wrong reasons. As he listened to Deepali mixing batter in the kitchen, he stood in the doorway of his and Naina's bedroom, watching Vritti and Rohini. They didn't know he was there. He was silent and invisible in his own home, a ghost of himself. Rohini took the lead, shouting instructions to Vritti to root out the boxes under the bed, while she dashed around the room, returning a comb to its rightful place in a shoebox on the top of the wardrobe, folding up shawls and tidying them away into a big wheelie suitcase, and packing away handfuls and handfuls of bangles. Mukesh watched as they dragged box after box out from under the bed. Vritti knelt to the floor, her cheek pressed against the carpet, and ran her hand to the left and to the right. All of a sudden, there was a clinking, clattering crash. "Oh God, what have you done?" Rohini groaned, staring down at her sister. Vritti pulled the box out, revealing a now half-emptied yogurt pot of mismatched earrings. Next came the Clark's shoebox of photographs that had entertained them all for hours on end when the girls were little, sitting on Naina's or Mukesh's knees, asking about their paisley patterned clothes and garish flares. Mukesh always thought they looked rather fashionable. The girls laughed at that. Then followed several pieces of empty Tupperware, and finally, one lonely, dust-covered library book. Riddhi slowed her pace for a moment and held it in her hands as Rohini knelt down beside her sister. "Papa," they called loudly, still oblivious he was only a few feet away. Deepali trotted into the room then too. "Mummy's book, well, library book," Rohini said. "I thought I'd returned them all, but I must have missed this one." She held it up to him, and he walked forward, not quite believing it, as though this dusty, icky, sticky book was some kind of mirage. When he'd seen the other relics of her life, he'd barely felt a thing. But here, seeing this book, the grey dust sticking to the plastic cover in splotches, it was like Nina was here in the room with them. Here, with his 3 girls, and one of Nina's beloved books. For a moment, just a moment, he didn't feel so alone.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to start with some questions that we put together, but we will save time at the end for audience questions as well. So we've read that the reading list was inspired by your love of libraries and books. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think it's probably no surprise. I love libraries. They've always been a really special place for me, and I really wanted to write a story that captures the importance of libraries. We all know that they're a brilliant place to find books, but they also bring people together. So that's what I wanted this story to capture. Ever since I was little, I used to go to my library every week. My dad would take me, and it was my favourite part of my week. I would love stepping through the doors and just seeing these shelves and shelves of books, and it felt like the world was limitless to me because I could pick one up, but then the next time I could pick 10 up and just read them. And I didn't have to stick to one genre or one author. I could try anything I liked. And there are so few places where you can do that. And I think my tastes and my imagination was really captured by my library, and my imagination flourished because of it. And I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be a writer now without my local library. So it turned me into a reader, and it turned me into a writer, and I'm so grateful for all it's done in my life.
Aww. We love to hear it, right? So our book club had a lot of questions about the reading list, the list specifically. So how did you come up with it? And is there a book you wish you had added to the list? And then I'll ask a little bit more after.
This is a really good question. Every time someone asks me how I came up with the list, I really want to say something super smart, like I knew exactly the books it needed for the pace and the narrative structure, but actually they're just books I loved. When the story came to me and I had Mukesh and Alicia in my mind, I knew them immediately. And I knew I wanted to write a book set in a library. And when I knew the list was going to be a crucial part, which was very early on, I just wrote a list of novels that I've loved. And those books are pretty much the list now. They're all books that I read as a teenager and completely loved. Lots of them were actually recommended to me by my teachers when I was kind of searching for books beyond the curriculum, and I was just a voracious reader, hungry to read more stories. And they had to make it on the list. I think that point at which you're falling in love with reading and realising how special reading is and how many books there are out there that you can enjoy, the stories you read at that time really stay with you, and these characters and these stories absolutely have stayed with me ever since. And it's convenient that the person who wrote the reading list has tastes just like mine. We love the same books, so that was helpful. But yeah, I just love those stories. They're all classics, but for such a brilliant reason, because they're so memorable and beautiful.
Is one of them a favorite of yours? Like if you had to pick one out of the list?
This is so hard. This is really hard. I love them all. I really love The Kite Runner. I just think that book has so much heart. I love that story so much. But for me, the one I recommend to everyone is A Suitable Boy, because so many people have put off reading it because it's so big. And it is really big, but it's really great. And it's just captures so many different characters. It's so rich. It's so emotional, and it gave me a really good snapshot of India at a particular part of its history, and I loved that story. So I read it as a teenager in a week, and I just couldn't stop reading it. If I was away from the book, I just wanted to be back with that book.
That's a good feeling.
Yeah, so I'd recommend that. Even though it's big, it's really worth it.
It's fantastic. So the story is told from multiple perspectives, including those of Mukesh, Alicia, and Naina, and it switches between the past and the present tense. So why did you choose to write in this unconventional narrative structure?
I really loved the idea of seeing the world through Alicia and Mukesh's eyes. I think you needed to see both of them. And that scene where Mukesh turns up to the library and he doesn't know how to open those library doors, and Alicia's getting annoyed with him already, and they really don't have a great time meeting each other for the first time. I love that scene. That was very much like one of the first scenes for me when I wrote the book, and I knew you needed to know what was going on in Alicia's world as well, and I kind of wanted the whole book to capture that idea of the people who walk beside us, who maybe are strangers or people we cross paths with but never really meet. They have whole lives and their lives are as complex as our own, and I wanted Mukesh and Alicia and their friendship to kind of show that to both of them, that while they first met and they were strangers, they actually understood each other way more as they got to know each other. And I think if we treat everyone around us with that understanding, that I think we should just be kind to people, even if they're grumpy to us. Because I look at Alicia, she was having a bad day, and rightly so. And Mukesh then had a bad day because she was rude to him. But I think when they got to know each other, they realised how much they could help each other. And so the book is set in London. It's a big city, and we walk past people every single day. And sometimes it can feel really lonely when you're surrounded by people, but you're not actually connecting. I think those moments of connection, even when maybe the person you're chatting to isn't someone you would normally hang out with, those can be the richest relationships and friendships, and I think we can learn so much from each other. So yeah, that's what I wanted that book to capture, and I think seeing the world through both their eyes was really important for that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think those kind of connections are what we love here at the library. We form these connections with a lot of our regulars who come in. I look out into the audience right now, and quite a few of you I recognize from here. And I just think it's such a lovely place to be able to form those connections. So, great choice of setting. So several members in our group resonated with the library as a source of community in the book and feel that they find that in our libraries. So, were or are the libraries in your community really in jeopardy of closing, like the one in the book?
Yes, in the UK, really sadly, I think we've got quite used to the phrase save our libraries. I think quite often so all our libraries in the UK, the public libraries, are like government funded, and whenever there's like budget cuts, quite often the arts and humanities are the first thing to go. And as someone who obviously is a huge advocate of the arts and humanities and books, I think that's the worst decision ever. But quite often our libraries have suffered because of that. So it's very different across the country, but I think quite often those smaller community libraries have been hit hardest, or maybe like their services have been moved into one bigger centralised library. And while I think it's brilliant to have libraries everywhere, and those central libraries are amazing, those community libraries do so much for people as well. And it means so much to have a library really close to where you live. I think that's really important. So pretty much ever since I can remember, I've heard of libraries closing down, and people get really angry about it, rightly so. And I think every author I talk to, it's one of the things they care about the most. Everyone I've worked with in publishing feels the same, because most authors I meet and most readers started their love of reading in a library, and I think that's so important. When I was growing up, I had a local library that I loved, and it was like magic to me. And for a few years, that library was closed down. And I remember just feeling like my town felt different. It felt like I wasn't going to see the same people who were like the regulars in the library. I thought about the librarian who listened to me talk for an hour and a half about a book I'd read really patiently as a child. And like, I wouldn't be able to go in there and just chat to them again. And it just takes the heart away, I think, of a community when a library closes. Our library did come back, but it came back a few years later in a much smaller way, and I'm so glad it's back there. But I just thought about all the kids in our town when that library was closed, who didn't have the opportunity to step into those library doors and pick any book off the shelf that they wanted to read that could take their imagination anywhere. And I really wanted this book to show the importance of libraries. Whenever I meet people in the UK, I also say, sign up for your library card and use your library. If you always worry about spending too much money on books, go to a library because you can pick anything you want. And I think the more people use libraries in the UK, hopefully the government will see how vital they are. But as I said, they're not just a place for books and stories. They're a place to bring people together, a place to feel less lonely in a very busy world. And they're one of our last public spaces that you can step into and you don't have to spend a penny. And those places are some of the most vital. So I really think libraries are amazing.
So our book club has expressed interest in reading a classic. So you kind of already did this, A Suitable Boy.
Yeah, but maybe now I could choose another one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so other than A Suitable Boy, what other classic would you suggest?
So, another one on the list. The Life of Pi. I love that book so much because what I love is it just captures so much in such an interesting world. Like being on a boat with a tiger, it feels like not many of us can relate to that, but the emotions in that book are so real, and I think we can all experience things like that feeling of walking on eggshells that Pi sometimes feels, but that feeling of bravery and having to stand up for yourself. And I think I love that book. When I read that book, it completely captured my imagination. I've read it a couple of times since, and every time I get something new from it. The film is great, but the book is
Always. Yeah, always. So, if you could choose one of the side characters from the book around whom you'd write a sequel, which one would it be and why?
Oh, this is another really hard question. So I think Priya would be my first choice. I'd write several books because there are lots of characters I want to explore. But Priya, I'd love to see her as she's older and how she's getting on with her grandfather and the reading list that they might create together. I kind of think that Alicia would be like a big sister to her. I think that friendship is going to be one that blossoms. I want to know what she ends up doing. Will she end up working in a library? I hope so. I think that would be so nice. So yeah, I think Priya, but I would also love to see what Alicia's doing, what Mukesh is doing, and Rohini, Priya's mum, and Mukesh's daughter. I want to see her as well because I love her. I have a real soft spot for her. She reminds me of my mum, and I think I would love to know how she's getting on, seeing her dad with all his new independence, the fact that maybe he doesn't need her quite as much. I want to know what Rohini's going to do when she doesn't have to fret about her dad and make sure that he's eating more than mung beans and okra.
Oh gosh, one of the things that I love about your book was the idea of the found family. They found that community together, and then they kind of formed their own family. I absolutely love that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for doing that. So we do have at least a few potential authors in this group. Can you tell us how you got started and how you stay motivated to continue writing?
Yeah, so I think being a writer is a really fun job, but it's also full of self-doubt and procrastination, and I do think they go hand in hand with the writing life. My first tip would be to ignore that inner critic. You have to get the words out on the page first, and then the inner critic can help you later on when you're editing. But I think focus on just getting those words on the page. Another thing that I would recommend is setting yourself small targets, but trying to write every single day. I don't live by this myself all the time. I try to, and when I do, it works best. But I always say, try writing 50 words, telling yourself that you'll sit down and you'll write 50 words, and it doesn't have to be any more. And once you've sat down to write 50 words, you might write 100, 150, could be 2,000, and you just get going, and it's great. But if you say to yourself, oh, I'm going to try and write 2,000 words, it's so much harder to sit down in the first place. So that's what I'd recommend, just writing, and just, small, easy chunks. How do you stay motivated? I think can be quite hard because I think there can be moments when you really just feel like not writing. And I think it's great if you can write every day, but if you can't, try and do something fun instead, like watch a film or read a book or go out to a museum or something like that just gets your mind going, or even sit in a cafe and listen to other people, sit in the library and hear what other people are talking about. Those little things I think can help spark ideas again. It's really hard if you're just looking at a blank page in front of you and no ideas are flowing. So I think you've got to get out into the world if you can and let your imagination flow from there.
That's a great suggestion, thank you. So we're gonna get a little sad for a moment here. Alicia blames herself for Aiden's suicide. She says, "I missed so much, I just had my head stuck in those books." Aiden's death was a surprise for many of us, and others saw something coming. What prompted you to include this in the story?
Yeah, for me, this was kind of very much the beating heart of the story when I first came to write it. Mental health and mental health awareness has been like really important for me for a long time. I lost one of my friends quite young, and I remember it felt like it came completely out of the blue when I was, and it felt like none of us saw it coming. And I wanted to sort of capture that feeling in Alicia and that guilt that you sometimes feel with that kind of loss, because you think, could I have done something more? Could I have done something better? And you get really caught up in that. And I think with Alicia, she feels like she missed things because of the books. And there's always something that will make you think, I could have done more. I really just wanted this story to spark conversations, because I think there's an awful lot more awareness now about mental health and mental ill health, but it still can feel really hard to open up and talk about things. And even if we know more, just starting that conversation can be one of the hardest things. And I think talking about things can really help. And I think some of the people with the biggest smiles on their faces, who seem to be the strongest, can sometimes be carrying the most. And just a question, how are you? How's it going? What's the weather like for you today? I think can be really important to getting that conversation going. So I know Alicia's story and Aiden's story can be a bit of a shock. I wanted it to just raise awareness that sometimes it can come out of the blue, and looking out for each other and a kind word can sometimes go a really long way. But I hope it sparks some conversations for people with their loved ones and the people we love the most. But also anyone around us in our world can be really important.
Great points. So part of the reason that Mukesh is compelled to begin reading is because his granddaughter Priya is an avid reader. Is there someone in your life who you shared the world of books with?
Really good question. I think loads of people in my life shared the world of books with me. I'm very lucky that all my grandparents really encouraged me to read. My granny would always give me books and recommend me books, and my dad was a huge reader as well. Mukesh in lots of ways is inspired by my dada, my maternal grandfather, because even though we quite often didn't speak the same language, he spoke Gujarati and I spoke English, and he spoke really good English, but in his house the conversation was all Gujarati. So I'd sit there hiding behind a book and eating loads of great food. And then I realised that books were the way into my world. So he wouldn't let me leave the house without asking me what the book I was reading was about. And I would talk to him for ages about it and tell him everything about the story. And talking about the story then made me start talking about myself. So he realised that was a way to get me to open up. And they're one of there's such small moments in our life together, but those moments are so special now. And I just think he thought about how to get me to talk. And in some ways, Mukesh and Priya's story was me asking the question, what if my dada hadn't had that love of books or noticed that books were the way into my world? So that's kind of the beginning of Mukesh's story, where he knows how to start to reach out to Priya. So it's very much a testament to all my grandparents and my dad, but in particular my dada.
Oh, I love that. I loved reading and seeing that close relationship blossom as we began reading more and more. Our last question on the list is, Mukesh develops a liking for reading as a way to cope with the loss of his wife, who used to love reading. What are your thoughts on reading as a coping mechanism or a coping strategy?
Really good question. I think lots of us probably have found comfort in books. I think books can bring us comfort, but they can always help us escape from things. Maybe if we need time to just get away, we can step into a book. But what I've loved about books is, I think, if I'm grieving or going through something I can't quite understand yet, sometimes I can see that in a book, and a book can sort of help me realise what I'm going through in a way. They can put words to feelings and make you feel like you're less alone, like you're not the only person in the world who feels like this. And I think that's quite magic. You can be reading a book about maybe an 18th century person, and you're like, oh, I really relate to that. or it can be a really contemporary book with a character who seems completely unlike you, but you totally get them. And I think that's the magic of stories, and I found comfort in them, I found companionship in them, and I think they really do have the ability to make you feel like you just aren't alone. And I think that can be really comforting and can definitely be a coping mechanism. It's not always, books aren't going to solve everything, but I think they can solve an awful lot.
They can definitely help us along our way.
Yeah.
For sure. So, do we have any questions from the audience today? Yes.
From Mukesh's point of view, I'm wondering, I was constantly surprised by how authentic the interiority felt, and I'm wondering how you got into that and found his voice.
Yeah, people ask me this a lot, and I think for me, Mukesh, I just knew him. As soon as I pictured him, I kind of knew how he sounded, I knew the way he walked in the world, and I think it's probably because he is inspired by so many people I love. So little parts of Mukesh are little parts of my family, and his clumsiness is definitely me. My family are all really cool, and they don't tumble over their feet like I do. But I think I just really had a clear sense of who he was, and probably just from watching the elders in my life and seeing the way they move about the world and having chats with them and things like that. So I'm really glad that people feel that he's authentic, because to me he's like completely real. So thank you so much.
I don't know if you know who Erica Baumeister is, the writer. She wrote The Scent Keeper.
Oh,
She
yeah.
also wrote a new book called No Two Persons, and it's about how no two people read the same book, which is very big in my mind, that no two people ever read the same book.
Yeah.
And I thought your book, first of all, was amazing. I loved it, and I'm a big reader, and I thought this was just the best book I've read in years. I loved it so much. It really sang to me. So much so that when I walk through the library and I see people looking at books, I'm like, have you read? So I do that all the time. But one of the things that I find interesting is the flip of this, which is I got so much out of it, and I'm wondering, when you talk to people through your travels now, if people are telling you things you didn't even know you were writing about.
Yeah, absolutely, all the time. There are so many, and like lots of, because in the book there are little characters and you get a glimpse of their lives, and there are other people in the community. I love finding people who have really connected with those characters as well, because most of them only have like a couple of pages, but I loved writing them because I just got to see a little snapshot into their world. And when I meet readers who kind of connected with those characters, and I love it, because they've taken so much from a really small piece of writing and created characters even larger than I could have imagined. And I just love when people point out symbolism and things to me. I was like, I had no idea that was in there. But it's really cool. So yeah, I love that. I feel like once you write a book, and you write one book, but then you kind of give it to the world and it becomes everyone else's book. And as you say, no two people read the same book. So this book is now, it belongs to all of you, and you will all have different things in that book that speak to you. So that feels like the most special thing ever.
That's the question, the crime book, the beginning of that.
I was wondering about Aiden's point of view, and what your decision-making process was for that, like to include it and then like briefly, but then not. I was wondering just your decision-making process in there.
Yeah, it's interesting because that scene, the very first prologue, was like the last thing I wrote. I remember like we were on the last draft, and my editor was like, maybe we need like a prologue or something, and I thought, I have no idea what it is. And then I thought, it has to be Aiden. It has to start with Aiden, because in so many ways Alicia's story began with him, and he was the one who encouraged her to go to the library and changed her life in so many ways. And you only get a snapshot of him, but I think you really get a sense of his heart and everything that he's going through, and I felt like people needed to see that, and I loved that scene so much, because of course you see the person who wrote the list there with him too, so you know that this story, Mukesh and Alicia's story, starts with both of them, and they're both there in the room together. So I loved writing that, but it was literally the last thing I wrote. But it felt, I think I like barely edited it at all. I wrote it just straight away, and I just knew it had to begin with him in so many ways.
Any other questions? Yes.
So my question has to do with some of the structural pieces. And you talked about writing the scene with Alicia and Mukesh at the library door early on. And as a writer, if you're getting yourself to write and you have all these pieces, how do you trust putting it all together into the narrative flow? And how does that work?
Yeah, I think the reading list was quite hard for me in many ways because I sort of wrote it chronologically at first, and my first draft was really baggy and messy and boring, really quite boring. There was loads of stuff in there that you guys didn't need to know. It was just me telling myself the story. And that's when, once I kind of took a step back and had a look at it, I could see the scenes that felt like they said the most and that showed the story and the world that the characters were in. So it was kind of a case of like pulling all the rubbish out of it, taking all the boring bits out. There are probably a few boring bits in there, but that's for me. I really enjoyed just like spending time with those characters. But it was really hard to work out like what those key scenes were, because for me, when you're so close to the book, they're all kind of key scenes. It felt to me that there were so many things that had to be said for these characters. So basically, testament to that has to go to my editor, who is just amazing. I was like, this is really crucial, this is really crucial. To the point that I was getting to the last draft and deciding, oh, take out that rubbish scene. And so basically it was a case of pulling it back and then letting those scenes speak louder and letting them have more space. But again, I think it was kind of quite hard to like know where to break up like Mukesh and Alicia's bits and how to intersperse them and like keeping the reader on their toes a little bit with the Mukesh, like end on a bit of a cliffhanger. That was fun. It was kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, like pulling it together. But yeah, I feel like now I look back, I'm like, oh, it was really easy, but I know at the time I was pulling my hair out trying to get it to work. So yeah, I think it was a case of pulling back the stuff that you didn't need and trying to make those key scenes shine more than ever.
Do you write all on a computer or do you write longhand also?
So with this one, I pretty much wrote all on the computer, but I'm actually writing a book at the moment that I'm pretty much just doing in a notebook. I'm finding it really freeing to just write in a notebook. There's something, it's almost daunting going to my computer and starting to type. So I'm enjoying like writing by hand and then typing it up later, because it feels like you can get lost in the story when you're just writing freehand. But yeah, this one I did write all on the computer, and it was useful in lots of ways. But I wonder what scenes I might have written if I had been writing in a notebook, because there's something freeing about writing just with a pen and paper. So I would recommend that as well if you're feeling stuck. Just getting a piece of paper and a pen, that's like the easiest way. When you've got that little cursor on a Word document blinking at you, it can feel like really quite daunting.
I think that as a student writing things for school, my mom taught us to, I'm old enough that we didn't have a computer, to write and leave spaces between every line.
Yeah.
And then she physically would have us cut and paste and move things around. And when we got into using computers, it's just interesting the strategy and how it impacts how you approach text.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really good.
And talk about your experience as an editor and now being an author and how that all works.
Yeah, so I got into publishing pretty much like straight after uni, and I was an editorial assistant for a while, so I was doing lots of the admin stuff and lots of the proof correcting things, and I just got to work with loads of authors and I loved that. I kind of stopped writing for a while, and then when I did start writing, because of my knowledge of the publishing world, I had a better idea of what publishing was like and what it would be to be a writer. But it wasn't until I was actually having to like edit my own work that I was grateful for all my years of experience as an editor, because I realised when I was an editor, I sort of thought, I'm just pointing out the really obvious things to these authors and they know these stories way better than me. But as a writer, as soon as you have an editor, you realise how valuable they are, because they point out the things you've completely missed. And it was a little bit difficult at first, kind of trying to switch off my editor brain and switch on my writer brain. It is slightly different, and it feels, I can't quite explain it, but you kind of do have to be freer as a writer, whereas an editor you can be a bit more objective and you're kind of a slight step back, but you're still really close to the work. So I was an editor for about 8 years, and I am now freelance, so I'm just writing, and I'm really noticing the difference. When I was trying to write and edit and publish books at the same time, I was constantly thinking about my work as the editor as well, like how I would pitch it, how I would market it, how I would edit it, what changes I want to make while I was writing it. And you sort of need to switch all that stuff off and forget about that, and it's just you and the book. And now I've got space from the publishing world, I can focus on the story itself and spend more time there and then think about the other stuff later. So yeah, it feels much easier now. I'm just doing one thing.
I think I saw some questions. Yes?
Yes, a couple of questions. One about your approach as writing. Who are you talking to as you write? Are you just coming out of you, or are you kind of talking to someone?
That's a really good question. I think I'm just talking to myself. I think I always,
That's valid.
yeah, I always recommend to people just start writing for you. I think when I was younger, quite often I wish that I could see characters like my family on the page. So the reading list does have like loads of elements of them and our lives together. So it just felt so special to be able to tell myself a story about a world I knew and loved. And for years, I think I'd been writing with a kind of reader in a bookshop in mind. Like all the books that I'd read, I felt like I was kind of emulating them, because I felt like they're the kind of books you need to write to be a serious published author. And then I think I read Zadie Smith's White Teeth, which is set in a similar area of London, northwest London, with characters who felt like people I knew and have loved in my life. And that's when I was like, I can write stories full of people who look like me, and that was really freeing. And now I just tell myself the story first of all, and I think the best way to get a story out is to write the book you want to read, because you will want to read it, but so many other people will as well. But you should be writing for yourself first and foremost.
And another question, thank you, about the issue of mental health. Of course, it's obvious, Aiden is a feature of that, but we didn't, you haven't actually verbalized to this group right now about the mother. And the mother is often, that's a face of mental illness that affects so many people that is never really seen and might not be understood in the behavior of the people coming out of that environment, So I just thought of it while you were speaking about both of those being very different spectrums. And, did you write it with that intentionality? Of showing this is the more sublime, this is the more out there, versus just it evolved.
Yeah, so I really had Alicia, Aidan and Leela's family set up really clear in my mind. I knew exactly what it felt like being in their house. And yeah, I wanted to capture that, because also I wanted, with Leela in particular, her family hold it all, they keep it all together, they don't talk to anyone else about it. And I think that's actually really very common. And I think I wanted to reflect that experience of what it feels like to hold something where really you want to be talking about it, and talking about it might help lighten it slightly or help you cope with it more. So I wanted to capture that feeling of what it's like when there's something so huge going on in your life and there are these moments. So with Leela, I never kind of explain what she has, and it's kind of up to readers to interpret. But I imagine her kind of having bad times, like going through moments where things aren't great. So it's not all the time, but when it is bad, it feels really bad. And so we see them in one of those summers where Leela's having a really bad time and Alicia and Aidan are having to cope with so much. So I really wanted to just focus in on what that must feel like to not be able to talk to people around you. And I don't think it's ever really explained in the book whether Leela asks them not to, or they just have this unspoken understanding that we don't take this outside of the family. This is just for us to know about, and kind of how that affects young people in the family in particular, but how it kind of like settles on you, I think. You like carry it with you as you step out into the world. And Alicia in particular feels like she can't connect with her friends, because how on earth would they understand what she's going through when they're going having a nice time in the park in the summer? And just how isolating that experience can feel. So yeah, that's what I wanted to capture there.
That's great.
Can you tell us what your new book's about?
Yes, so The Twilight Garden is another story of unlikely friendship. It's set with two neighbours, Winston and Bernice, who hate each other. But unfortunately, they've got a shared garden, so they need to find a way to work together. So you see that garden as it is now, a bit overgrown, full of weeds and foxes. But you also see that garden decades earlier when it was looked after by two best friends and it was a real community hub. So those two stories of the garden intertwine, and at some point they might cross over. So yeah, I hope people really enjoy that. I love that book so much. So yeah, I hope you like it.
I saw a question here and then over there as well. Go ahead.
So you were at, on the Island Library earlier this week, and now you're in this library. So I wonder, as you tour around, what your impression is of our libraries.
Yeah, I think it's so lovely to see so many people in your libraries, and such brilliant libraries that have so many amazing books on the shelf. I've loved seeing your libraries because, yeah, I think there are lots of libraries I've been in the UK where there aren't that many books on the shelf, and that always feels a bit sad to me. But it's been really nice to meet everyone and all of you who make the library what it is. So it's been such a joy to kind of see such well-used libraries and to meet all the readers who make it what it is.
You mentioned that you were going to New York
Yes.
City. Are you going to get to go to the New York Public Library?
I hope so, yeah.
Oh, have you been before?
No, never. This is my first time in the US.
Oh, very nice. I hope you have a marvelous time.
Thank
You
you.
can see the original Winnie the Pooh.
Ma'am in the back.
Me in the back.
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry. Oh, is there someone else back there?
No.
Me? Oh. I'm part of a book club that meets once a month, and we read your book in September, and so I was tickled pink when I saw you were going to be here, so I brought some in my book club. And I also teach third grade here in the county, so thank you for being here on a Friday so I can have a 3-day weekend. Took the day off. But 8-year-olds, I think, authors are so abstract to them, they don't realize that you are a real person. So they lost their minds when I told them I was going to be here to meet you. And I'm going to cry because they're so cute. You know, we found England on a map and India on the map. And did I read you have Kenyan roots, or am I confusing you with someone else?
No, so my mum grew up in Kenya. She was
Okay.
born and grew up in
Well, we
Kenya.
found Kenya on the map too. So that
Amazing.
made it kind of real. And when they see the picture Monday morning, they're going to be really happy that you were here. So thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
I do not have a question for you. Thank you.
Yes.
One of the best things I like about this library is that they have interlibrary loan. So we can get books from actually all over Florida. And what's really amazing is that the public universities and even the private universities, I can get books. There's interlibrary loan extends to those
Wow.
facilities, and I don't know if that's true in every state. And I'm wondering if it's true. If it is it true in every state? Is it true in every country? Because it is amazing what is in the libraries of our public universities.
Oh, that's really, yeah, I don't know. But in the UK, so where I am, my local library where I live now, for ages only had its own collection of books, but now it's part of, I think, a consortium. So there's access to so many books. I'm not sure if universities are included there, but you actually get access to so much. And I think one of the great things as well is there's like free ebooks and free audiobooks. So you don't even have to have the physical book. If you kind of use audiobooks or ebooks, you can access them too for free, which is just amazing to me. So now my to-read list is so long, and I've got so many holes that I'm waiting for. So yeah, it's the best thing.
It's a struggle.
Yeah.
I have a sort of a general daunting, challenging question. There's been so much talk about AI, and I'm wondering, with you being closer to the industry, if you feel like the fear is heated, if that's really happening, and where you think the industry is going in terms of that.
Yeah, I try not to think about it too much because I find AI a bit scary. I'm sure it's going to do brilliant things as well, and already is, but I think there is a lot of discussion about like authors' rights and copyright laws around AI, and I think it's something that's so new that there's still so much to kind of be like ironed out with that. I really think, like, I know I personally would much prefer to read a book written by an author than by a computer trying to be an author. So while it's really smart, I do think readers will still want books by real life authors, because a book is like a connection, and you want to feel connected to someone, who's like sat down at a desk and written it, I think. Though it is like amazing what technology can do, and quite scary with that. I don't know all the intricacies of it, but I know personally I will always be reading books by authors who aren't computers.
I'm a grandparent of kids in elementary school here in this county, and it's freaking me out, the book banning. Like, really freaking me out. The books that are being pulled off the shelves are things that I've read my whole life and encourage my grandkids to read. And I wonder when people are writing now, if they have an ear to that or an eye to that, to think, oh, I can't include this because it might elicit a ban. Oh, I don't want to put a lesbian in a book because, oh, there goes the ban. Or anything that would stop someone from being authentic when they write. I'm wondering if it's ever something that, I don't know if they deal with, if you have that in the UK like we have here. I mean, censorship is horrific as far as I'm concerned, but I wonder if that colors how people are writing.
I think that's a really good question. So I don't know an awful lot about the context here, because in the UK, as far as I'm aware, we don't have the same sort of thing. And as someone who writes really diverse characters, I also know, as a child growing up, I was so searching for people who look like me and have my experience, and I really value having those books out there. I think that's one of the things I found hardest as an editor as well, because I think even just as an editor, you have to be aware of sensitivities, and you're constantly thinking about that and the market. So it's not the same kind of thing, but just having to think about a market can always make you think, oh, how do I write this to make sure it's right for this market? So it's not the same subject. But yeah, I remember feeling like that sometimes blocked me if I was just thinking about what I can and can't write, what I should and shouldn't write. And I think authors should write sensitively and carefully, and they should, and that's important. But I also think freedom to read is really amazing. And for me, as a child growing up, having access to loads of different books was so incredible and vital to me. But I do think it's really important for authors to be able to step back away. You kind of do have to take your way out of the world a little bit to write the story that feels right to you. And I really hope that authors find the space to write the books that mean something to them and speak from their heart. And I hope we'll always have books from a whole range of writers, from a whole range of backgrounds, because I think it's so important for that, and for people to read those stories. And I think it's so brilliant because we've got such a vast array of novels being published now, and I know the publishing world is really changing as well, and that's really good, and being much more inclusive. And that's something that I will always speak out for, because I think books on inclusivity that include so many different people really vital to our world, because it's the world we live in and the world we should be celebrating. So I really hope that authors tell the story that feels true to them, rather than thinking about anything else, and just tell their story. That's what I'm hopeful.
Thank you.
Just a comment and a follow-up with that. I retired from public school teaching after 30 years, but I think all the more reason why public libraries are going to be so essential, because when schools have their hands tied in that way, teachers have to forfeit books from their classroom libraries, we can at least say, you can find that book at the library, at the public library. So I just am so appreciative that we have such a great system here in St. Johns County. Also, I wanted to comment with you about the reluctant reader taught elementary school, and finding the right book for that child to make a connection to build that love of reading is so important. And I especially love that Mukesh experienced it as an older gentleman, because we often, when we get to be my age, you just figure I'm not a reader. And it's just so beautiful that he discovers that. And I'm going to use it now to say, you're going to be able to become a reader, you just have to find the right book.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I loved that you included that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a nod to all my friends who say, I only read non-fiction, or I only read books that teach me things.
Yes.
I'm like, fiction can teach us so much.
It does, yes.
So don't turn your nose up at fiction, because it's the best.
Yes.
So you've talked a lot about books that you love as a reader. Who do you like to read as a writer?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have really been enjoying Elizabeth Strout books recently. So whenever I'm a bit stuck with reading, I will step into an Elizabeth Strout book because her characters are so brilliant. I really love her books. I've mentioned it at lots of these events, but Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Yeah, it's been everywhere, but it's amazing. And that book, I remember thinking, I want to write a book as good as this. I want to write a book that makes me feel the way that this book has made me feel, because I think she just captures that beauty of friendship so well. So yeah, I think probably there are two of them that I often go to, but Zadie Smith quite often. Ali Smith, I don't know if you've read Ali Smith, but she has such an incredible way of using language, and she's always inspired me as a writer because her writing is exquisite. And if I ever feel a bit stuck, I'll read an Ali Smith. But also Arundhati Roy, The God of Small Things, is my favourite book ever, and that's again like Arundhati Roy's writing. Her prose is incredible and so beautiful, and so vivid. So I look to those writers who can just like write the most magical sentences. And you don't even see the craft there because it just washes over you and it captures you and takes you away.
Any other questions before we? Yes, ma'am.
Are you also a lover of poetry and prose?
Yes, I don't read enough poetry. But I should.
Stories?
Yeah, I love short stories. Yeah, but I should read more poetry. I read a lot at uni and loved it. But I always feel like I just reach for fiction now. I want something long to get lost in. But when I do read poetry, yeah, I really love it. I don't think I could ever write poetry. Not good enough.
Last question I have. Was there a book that didn't make the list that you are missing?
So, good question. I think The Time Traveler's Wife is in the book, but that used to be on the list. But then I like needed it for too many scenes. It had to just like stand apart from the list. So probably it's like an honorary mention on the list. I think there are too many books that I would add on now. I would probably write like a book that's 3,000 pages long about every book that I've loved, and no one would read it but me. But yeah.
Yes.
Hi. I like to read more than one book at a time, and I wonder, do you also do that? And if you do, how many books right now are you reading?
So when I was in publishing, I had to read about 9 books a week, and so often I'll be reading loads at the same time, and that's just like books that were coming in on submission, and I'd be reading like a fiction book that I wanted to read, and then a fiction book I needed to read for research, and then like a non-fiction book just to like find out about something new. And now I think I'm trying to just read one book at a time. But sometimes I'm like, oh, I've got a hardback that I really want to read, and I'll just read that at bedtime. And then I've got a paperback that I'll take on the tube with me. And then I've got an audiobook for when I'm doing washing up. So I do quite enjoy like reading like that, but it's like different moods. I think I'm a definite mood reader now. So I know the kind of book I need at a certain point in my day, whatever. So probably about 3 is the maximum I have on the go now, which feels like a good break from 8.
Okay. Sarah, thank you so much for coming today, for visiting with us.